think that Jonesville became a community within a community. It was a safe place. There was a sense of joy.
We still have the memory of it in our minds, and the ones that are living would be able to tell the history of our community.
The most amazing thing to me about Jonesville is that it was a full functioning community where they had everything they just needed.
It was an empty feeling of not having that connection to that particular community and even to our family. It was empty.
The people that lived there were happy, and how we didn't bother anybody.
The government just can't come in and take my property. I own this. You know, they couldn't get that in their heads that you can just come in and just say, I'm going to take it. That didn't sound American to them, that you could just come in and take my property. I bought this. I paid for this.
It was just a close-knit community, you know. We were dispersed, even though it was a closely knit neighborhood, but our hearts and minds were always there. I mean, we always went back for something.
I want to vent and share a story that's weighed heavily on my mind for many years. Family ties and my family lineage have always been important to me. I can recall many festive occasions that took place in Jonesville on my ancestors' property, which was the Bailey family. To this day, I have very warm and fond memories of these gatherings. These affairs often included neighbors and family as well.
Prior to the Civil War, about a third of the population of Warren County was enslaved. Because Kentucky never joined the Confederacy, Lincoln didn't do anything to help you until the summer of about 1864, when the decision was made to offer enslaved persons the opportunity to gain their freedom by serving in what was known as the U.S. Colored Troops. So if you joined the U.S. Colored Troops, you could get like a $300 signing bonus, which with $300 you could have bought a farm. After the Civil War in Warren County, there were only certain places where African Americans could either purchase land and or find a house to live in. And in Warren County, the area of Jonesville was available to them. And so you started to see some settlement there. Jonesville was not in the city of Bowling Green. It would have been considered a village within Warren County. Although it was adjacent to the city, it was never a part of the city boundaries. It was recognized as a place by outsiders. When you look at the 1880 census, you see the village of Jonesville at the top of the page. Many of them used their Army earnings to purchase land, and that land became that first step in creating generational wealth. You can look at the history of Jonesville and find households from the 1880 census who owned their land, and that same land stayed in the family through the 1950s and 60s, when ultimately became part of WKU.
It was not a rundown community. It was not blighted. It was not a raggedy community, you might say. It was one that was cheerful. I can picture houses in my mind now, up and down Route 4, known as the Russellville Road. And I remember seeing sunflowers and flowers, well-kept lawns. People took pride in their community. And so that was the way I would describe it, not what you might have thought it would be, because it was an African-American community, that it was not. It was not slummy. It was not dilapidated. It was none of those things.
I was first introduced to Jonesville when I was 5. After returning home from a basketball game right here with my father at Diddle, my mom basically exclaimed, "I was born there." And so my 5-year-old mind couldn't quite grasp the concept of not being born in a hospital, nor of the fact that anything else but Diddle had been on that land since the beginning of time. So for a very long time, I just assumed that my mom was born right here in the middle of a basketball arena. In truth, like many Black babies born during the era of segregation, she was born at her family home, delivered by a Black doctor in a place called Jonesville, Kentucky. But before I would learn about the community that shaped my mom by name, I learned the names of all of my relatives from Jonesville. It was a community that I'd never be able to visit because it was demolished in the decades before my birth to make way for the expansion of Western.
Bowling Green and Warren County, back to very early in the 19th century, had wanted to establish a strong educational foundation here in the town and the county, and there had been a number of efforts along those lines. But the game changer in terms of educational opportunities here was Southern Normal School, which moved to Bowling Green from Glasgow in the mid-1880s. And Henry Hardin Cherry and his brother come to town. Cherry enrolls as a student. 6 years later, he owns a school. And he becomes very much committed to the normal school movement. Normal schools were schools that prepared the students to be teachers. So Cherry champions the normal school movement. We need public normal schools here in Kentucky. And in 1906, the Kentucky General Assembly creates Bowling Green State Normal School. And they name Henry Hardin Cherry president. Jonesville is established in the 1870s or so. Western doesn't move to the hilltop until 1911. So Jonesville was certainly very well established before Western Kentucky State Normal School moves into the neighborhood.
Renowned poet and thought leader Elizabeth Alexander recently said that communities of color have for a long time, quote, carried around knowledge and stories in our bodies because the resources were not devoted to preserving the spaces that held these stories. For as long as I can remember, my mother ensured that I carried the memory of Jonesville with me every day until I too carried it around in my body. I can't remember a day in my life without her referring to members of our Jonesville ancestors by name in the tradition of our African roots. Mama Lizzie, Daddy Bob, Mom Ellen, Uncle Harry, Uncle Will, and Aunt Lucille are just some of the many of our long-deceased Jonesville ancestors who were mentioned at our home.
You could see the love that we had for each other and for the peace of the community. It's kind of hard because all of our grandparents and parents and everybody are gone. My children don't even know the story of Jonesville because they didn't live there. They weren't raised out there. They don't know the story that I know. Our way of life was destroyed. The attachment that we had to the people that lived in Jonesville at that time was destroyed. Livelihoods were destroyed. It was just a terrible time. And it's horrible to try to tell somebody how it was too, without you actually being there and seeing what was going on, and it's just because they can't, you can't, they don't know the story. I did graduate from Folk Studies Department at Western Kentucky University. I do have a master's degree from Western. And all of my work, most of my work that I done had been on Jonesville. No matter what class it was, I would always tell them about the community, and they will always let me write my papers about Jonesville. So that's how most of my documentation came about.
Jonesville, my connection is my great-grandfather owned several lots there. My great-grandmother and their brothers and sisters, and my grandfather also, they all owned several lots in Jonesville, several acres from the top to the bottom, spread out around through Jonesville. Of course, Jonesville, when I was born, was already gone, but when we would go through there, we still own property still close to there. Like we own property on High Street, and they would tell me stories about how they lived, what went on there, and how the community was. And it was just amazing to know that it's a full functioning community. I just love the things about Jonesville.
I don't think I grew up wanting or envying anybody else and what they had, because what I had was pretty good and pretty nice, and I enjoyed it. My father was not a rich man, nor my mother, but they were working people, working class people, worked hard. They knew who they were and who they wanted to be, and they were not defined by what others said about them. They don't know us. They don't know who we are, because actually they had been fabulous neighbors. Those white children who went to Western cannot say they were ever bothered or molested by anyone in that community. They walked through our communities, going to places. They were not afraid either. So it worked on both sides. It was very symbiotic. We were good neighbors, and we thought at the point that they were good neighbors.
So I was drawn to this project because I didn't know much about Jonesville. The process for me has been different than others involved. I'm not a living descendant of Jonesville. I'm not a relative of a Jonesville resident, and I'm not a WKU alumni. Yet the stories that we learned about these individuals and families, the beloved and peaceful community they shared, it was just all so beautiful, so beautiful. And then to learn in reality how dozens of families were forced to move from their homes and property that they and their ancestors had spent hundreds of years creating, to only receive pennies on the dollar for it. The total loss, in my opinion, the total theft, is personally, socially, and economically incalculable.
Kelly Thompson came to Bowling Green in 1928 as a student at Western Kentucky State Normal School and Teachers College. And Cherry makes him a director of public relations in the 1930s. In 1937, Cherry dies, and Paul Garrett becomes president. And Thompson continues to work in the Garrett administration. Garrett makes him assistant to the president. And by that time, Garrett's health was beginning to decline. So over time, this Kelly Thompson takes on more and more responsibility until he finally is chosen president after Garrett's death in 1955. there is a kind of pent-up sense of possibility that's coming in with Thompson in 1955. And he is exactly the sort of personality to take advantage of that and to ride a rising crest, not only nationally but also here locally, in terms of what's possible for this institution. For most of its early history, WKU was a small college on the top of what's probably known more now as College Heights. But it was a campus that fit pretty nicely within that kind of parameter. As the college begins to expand in the years after World War II, if you go from 2,000 students to 11,000 students, if you go from 100 faculty to nearly 600 faculty, that tight little fitting at the top of the hill just didn't work so much anymore. And so particularly in the years after World War II, the college begins to spill steadily down the sides of the hill and begins to expand and begins to look for other places, other land that it might feel like it needs for further expansion.
Many students and professors at WKU often express surprise at the very existence of Jonesville. I too grew up with Jonesville all around me without even realizing it was there. I'm a millennial, born in a generation after the destruction of Jonesville. As many living descendants and residents have told me, the adults displaced from Jonesville protected their offspring from learning the harsh realities of just what happened. I too was protected. Occasionally, I'd hear hints and passing conversations about those relatives who were displaced. The fiery and passionate discussions often focused on the injustice of what happened to specific parcels of land. When
Thompson first brings the possibility of acquiring what he called the Russellville Road property to the Board of Regents, he made reference to a 50-year problem in conjunction with Jonesville. In looking at the minutes of the Board of Regents, it seems like he is talking about 5 pieces of property that jut into the other side of Russellville Road, which is primarily where the university is. I don't know whether he meant just those 5 parcels or whether he meant Jonesville generally.
It wasn't like there was just Jonesville and a university. Those things were just sort of very organic and growing around each other. And there were connections between them even before Western, in any of its iterations, existed. For example, the parts that sort of came together to form WKU had connections to Jonesville. So like the Potter College for girls, there were people who lived in Jonesville who were employed in the Potter College. And then later, when you had the normal school, again, Jonesville individuals were employed here even before it was Western. So there were always interrelationships between Jonesville and what becomes Western, whether they're economic, cultural, spatial, historical.
We were integral to that community and they to us. There was a community right across from Jonesville, which Western built. It was called Vets Village, where veterans who had returned from war, this is where they went to live with their families to go to school at Western, Kentucky. All white. There were no blacks there, but they were across Russellville Road, just adjacent to Jonesville. There was a store that was built there by Mr. Reeves called Village Market. And in front of this was a kind of a grassy ellipse in front of the Village Market. And every summer, he would have a outdoor movie pavilion for the community. We all went, black and white, together. Now, those are the relationships that you have to understand that existed and why we were not afraid of one another.
Through archival history, I later learned that many residents, including those in my own family, didn't leave without a fight. In the late 50s, as Western began to envision what would arguably be one of the largest land grabs in the city's history, my great-grandmother, Ellen Taylor Alexander, and her brothers, Harry and Will Taylor, owners of the 3 of the first 5 properties taken, made the bold decision to face Western in court, fighting for their right to keep their land. Seemingly having everything to lose, they, along with 2 other property owners, Ida Bell Johnson and Lenny Cox, retained their own legal counsel, challenging the premise of the land taking itself, as well as the university's offer of compensation for the land. Western used all available avenues to further cheapen its cost in acquiring the properties. Counsel for Western expressly suggested using the residents' race as a basis to place the lowest possible value on the Jonesville properties.
For the first 5 parcels, that is a process of Thompson going to the board, saying, I want to acquire this, and we may have to use condemnation to do that. And the board votes to approve that.
The condemning agency has to pay a fair market price for the property to the owners of that property. But at that time, the Federal Housing Administration had guidelines, and the guidelines were that if it was a neighborhood that was mixed race, or, and I'll just quote from the federal guidelines, inharmonious racial or nationality groups. By the definition of the Federal Housing Administration, were neighborhoods where there were large numbers of minorities. And in that time period, in the 40s and early 50s, that was mostly the African American minority. And that persisted on, and even in the appraisal guidelines, and this is where we'll get back to the lawsuit and the Western Kentucky case. The appraisal guidelines said the property is worth less if it is in a neighborhood that has inharmonious racial or population. And so the appraiser, for the real estate appraiser, would say, well, this is in a bad neighborhood, inharmonious neighborhood, and so therefore, instead of this house being worth, let's say back in those days, $30,000, it's only worth $20,000. And that lowered the value of all the homes in those neighborhoods. So it was the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration, that set those guidelines for inharmonious racial neighborhood. Let's take it to the Western Kentucky case. In eminent domain, there is always an appraisal done. There's one appraisal done by the appraiser for the condemning authority, the governmental agency, and then there's an appraisal done by appraisers for the court. And in this case, the appraisals for the court came out a little higher than the appraiser for the Western Kentucky appraiser. And then the private citizens tried to get appraisals, and they got appraisals that were higher, but the lower appraisals in 1957, which this time period, the lower appraisals were still going on that theme of inharmonious racial neighborhood. And generally speaking, the appraisals in a minority neighborhood would come out much lower when the state of Kentucky or the Western Kentucky University or any other governmental agency wanted to buy it. And so that's something that those families, those owners of that property, may have suffered in that whole process.
process goes forward and the property is acquired, and the board then has to officially accept it. So for Thompson to be able to acquire property, he has to have permission first from the Board of Regents, and the Board of Regents has to formally accept that property.
I often wonder what the family matriarch, Mama Lizzie Taylor, who fought so hard to maintain the land for future generations, would think about the prospect of her farm being gone forever. But I'm sure she would have been proud of her children for putting up a fight as they were working for the preservation of the land for future generations, including my own. As a public interest attorney, their example planted the seed for the development of my own career in public interest law. My involvement with the Jonesville Reconciliation Work Group, and my involvement with a national effort to address similar university-driven urban renewal projects that happened all over the country.
But when urban renewal came and the whole replacement of us out of that community, it was not a happy time. I think mostly because people did not understand how you could condemn their properties when they had worked so hard to get them.
Western wanted the land to expand its campus and had little regard or empathy for the impact it would make on the people of Jonesville. Expansion was more important to them than the lives of people who had worked hard to build a thriving community. It was not until I was a little older that I really understood what had taken place. The city of Bowling Green and Weston had devised a plan to take the land from the Jonesville residents in a very unfair manner. This plan was a government program that was being used all over the country to acquire land from the Black neighborhoods called urban renewal.
So in very basic terms, urban renewal was a period and a process in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, all across primarily urban America, to figure out how to compensate for, adjust for the fact that we were shifting from being a primarily urban society to an increasingly suburban society.
The suburbs, almost as much written about as Madison Avenue, and just as much in need of reflection.
So their efforts in this was, well, we need to create pathways that allow suburbanites to get back and forth from suburb to city to work. But the underside of urban renewal is that these bridges and tunnels, these access points were created right at the heart of Black and brown communities. And much of the logic for this was the argument that certain neighborhoods were what we call blighted.
Urban renewal, historically, is supposed to be used to erase blighted areas. And when something is determined to be blighted is always a tough question. In Louisville, for example, Walnut Street, back in the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, was a very prominent African-American neighborhood and commercial area. And in the 1950s, the city of Louisville decided that they wanted to erase that neighborhood, and so they called it blighted and ended up tearing it all down and building new buildings there. And urban renewal has been used all over the country, in many cases misused, because just because a neighborhood is Black or Latino or maybe a little bit less, not as nice as far as aesthetically as some other neighborhood, somebody decides to get rid of it, basically.
The underside is that they targeted Black and brown communities, and these people were displaced. And the prosperity that was created there, that could have increased over decades in terms of home value, community stability, we will never know, because it was ruined through federal policy and the way federal policy was implemented.
You said federal policy, so meaning that every state, could take advantage of these programs. I'm wondering though, you're talking about interstates and things that are related to city development. How do you think that universities, how did they tap into this urban renewal process, and what were the steps that they had to do?
Thank you for that question. This is at the heart of my work. The role that universities played in urban renewal historically, and how that's created impacts that resonate that have ripple effects to this day. How universities use urban renewal policy to become the friendly face of demolishing and displacing Black and brown communities in the name of urban renewal. The group of urban universities, NYU, Columbia, UC Berkeley, and Johns Hopkins and a few others, led by the University of Chicago, got together and created a lobbying group and lobbied the federal government to create an alteration to the Housing Act of 1949. It's been shorthanded as the 112 Credits Program. Now, what this program did, which is pretty amazing, is that this program basically said that if a university is at the front of a general urban renewal project in your city or town, for every $1 that the city contributes, the federal government will contribute $2.
Wow.
So what do you think happened? Cities and city leaders flocked to their local universities to partner with them to create a university-driven urban renewal plan that could get all this additional funding by the university.
Thompson says that he first learned about urban renewal while he was drinking coffee one morning at a drive-in restaurant here in Bowling Green in August of 1961. And he apparently immediately saw its possibilities for Western. And within just a few weeks, he convened a meeting in the faculty house, a meeting that included the mayor of the city of Bowling Green, the county judge executive, several members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, some members of the Bowling Green City Commission, several folks from WKU, and presented this idea of an urban renewal effort here in Bowling Green. And I think that meeting is the immediate catalyst for the rest of that process. And I don't think that the city and the county took much convincing. I think there was urban renewal was a well-received thing in many communities across the United States at that time. And I think an ambitious community of Bowling Green and Warren County saw urban renewal as something with possibilities for them.
After meeting with President Thompson, these local leaders quickly announced the formation of an Urban Renewal Commission. Forming this commission was the first step in applying for federal funds to be used to seize local property.
Through the following decade, the Urban Renewal Commission would begin sealing the fate of the remaining Jonesville property, facilitating appraisals that resulted in offers that were often a small fraction of what similar new properties would cost.
And then they could hand over that property to Western to use to grow and prosper. And as a natural byproduct, Bowling Green would grow and expand also. And this process happened in almost 200 communities across America. But did the people who created those communities grow and prosper too? For the great majority of them, no. No.
Owning your own home, especially free and clear without a mortgage, that's security. And if you look at how generational wealth has been created in this country, whites have had a huge advantage over African Americans in accumulating generational wealth. They've had a head start on that process. So in the case of Jonesville, that land is not just an emotional attachment to land, which is a very big thing. I don't want to, downplay that, but that security that you own this is your land and no one could take that away from you. At least that was your assumption. That generational wealth that, you had a soldier or their relatives coming out of the Civil War, purchasing the first land, keeping it in the family, for decade upon decade. That is something that is just like sort of the definition of the American dream.
So in my household, my mother often spoke fondly of Reverend Taylor. He was a beloved pastor who cared deeply about the members of his congregation, as well as an outspoken member of the community on matters of faith and society.
We had a dynamic minister named Reverend Jesse Howard Taylor, and he made sure that all the kids were in the forefront of everything. We had to sit on the front seat. All the children sat on the front seat on Sundays. And if we got to moving a bit much, he'd go, "All right, Ann, sit up." And that's all he had to say to me at one time. He never had to say it again because I was so embarrassed. So he had all the children doing all these things, and we had fun. We had camp.
At different holidays, the church always had activities for us to do. And it was just, they just made sure we had what we needed in the community to live.
When you talk about Mount Zion and Jonesville, the one name that continues to come up is Pastor Jesse Taylor. He was effective. He was visionary in the sense that, from what I understand, that he was really a man before his time, in the sense that he was a man of vision. He was the leader that emerged as that leader who thrived. He loved the community. The community loved him. I hear a plethora of stories about how they were young. He would pile them into station wagons, take them to Sunday school. He was not just a priestly, in the priestly meaning or the pastoral, but he was prophetic in the sense he understood Micah 6:8 calls us to love mercy, to do justice, and to walk humbly before our God. Matthew 23:23 says, "These things you ought to have done and not left the weightier matters undone." What are the weightier matters? Doing justice. And what we discover is that a lot of people, they don't mind doing, and leaders, we don't mind doing the priestly part. We don't mind doing the pastoral. We just don't want to get involved with the justice work.
As Jonesville faced destruction, Reverend Taylor became the face of the resistance. Most notably, he defended the rights of those who lived in Jonesville, leading a local committee for the protection of property rights. Reverend Taylor also became well educated on urban renewal elsewhere in the state and even in the nation, learning about what, if any, legal or other recourse the citizens of Jonesville might have. Through letters and other correspondence beginning with phrases such as, "We the residents of Jonesville," he tried to negotiate the best terms with city lawmakers, commission members, Western officials, and even President Thompson himself.
So in nearly 200 black communities like Jonesville, all over the country, pastors like Reverend Taylor were challenged to lead their communities and congregations to a way to survive the utter destruction of their homes and communities. So for Pastor Taylor and pastors of his generation, the destruction and dismantling, the devastation of urban renewal was perhaps the greatest test of their calling.
Though relations between the church and Western were often described as congenial, Western archives show that he was deemed to be a threat to the completion of the Jonesville acquisition on more than one occasion. Through his numerous letters to the editor, he appealed to the public consciousness of both white and black citizens of Bowling Green, centering on the central themes of morality and fairness to hardworking property owners.
Reverend Taylor worked so hard. This man was a champion. And he could do that because he was not beholden to Western. And that's important when ministers hold those positions in those communities, because the people in Jonesville, several of them worked at Western.
And I think we need to keep this in mind, because we're looking at Bowling Green, and we're looking at what happened with the Western Kentucky University and the role that Jesse Howard Taylor played in it. But we need to understand that this was not unique to Bowling Green at that time. This was a microcosm of a larger narrative that was going on at that time. But I believe that his faith informed and inspired him, and his decisions going forward. I think there had to be moments of fear, anxiety. I don't know this, but it's very possible he had some sleepless nights. I can only imagine being displaced from everything that's familiar to you to now being forced out to, and now they're looking to this man. You got to remember the role and the influence he played.
So I asked myself, why am I telling you this story? I would like for people to understand the impact of unfair dismantling and destruction of neighborhoods such as Jonesville.
It would just been a great impact for our family to have developed along with Bowling Green in that same community, because we were developers too, we were builders too.
It was heartfelt, and sometimes it's hard to put in words because you had to have almost been a part of that community to realize the full impact. But it was borderline devastating, to tell you the truth, because it meant families were going to be separated. We still tried to have family reunions and gatherings in different locations.
I never felt the same, though. I know we did it in Indianapolis, we did it in Detroit, but it was nothing that ever felt like being in Jonesville.
It was irreplaceable.
The process should be fair, centered around fairness.
Unfair is a good word. Unfair to condemn houses that were not really condemnable. And then to think that's what you got compared to what they gained was just, it makes you angry. It makes me angry when I'm sitting here talking about it now.
But the current prosperity of these institutions sits on this theft, sits on this trauma, sits on this pain. The prosperity and the stability didn't come out of nowhere. So everyone, if there's prosperity today, everyone that has played a role in that should benefit.
The Urban Renewal Commission didn't care that entire families relied on this land. Some people, like my sister, had to examine the amount of the commission was being given to the families and to calculate what each member would receive once the property was taken.
I was 15 when I was given that assignment by my grandfather. Find out how many adults there were, cousins, adults, and everybody who was going to get, first of all, the direct siblings, his siblings, how much they would get, and then how much their children would get. And when I saw those numbers developing on that paper, down to 1,200 for these 3 children who were descendants of one who had passed. It was like, that's it? And I mean, I think that was 1965. I mean, we weren't rolling in money, but I knew enough to know that $1,200 for all of that land is all you're gonna get from it. And once I got past the assignment of it, like my homework, then it occurred to me, this is wrong. I even knew that at 15. That's nothing. This is stealing.
I think there was a strong sense of community and pride. Others may look at it, talked about how dilapidated it became, and we need to make these improvements. But that's not what I gather from the people who live there. They were very proud of where they lived, who they were, and what they had. Because it may not seem like much to others, but it was theirs. It was what they worked and built. It was something that they could call their own. And to have it to be taken away from them like that, I think had a profound impact.
Coming to terms with our past is part of being honest with ourselves, honest with the community around us. And it's part of how we craft what the future needs to be for us.
So while doing this research for this project, I was speaking with Bobby Austin. He mentions when he was a kid in Jonesville, and he says he rode to the school with my mom, Julie Martin Hayes, and her sisters, my aunts, Cindy and Bee. I was like, Bobby, what are you talking about? I had no idea that my mom once lived in Jonesville. No one had ever told me about this. And so I got this whole new appreciation for my mom, this love for my mom. And while, Jonesville, the place was destroyed, the people like my mom and Pastor Jesse H. Taylor were not destroyed. And it just made me see how, I was part of Jonesville, that my family was a part of Jonesville. And I think a lot of people, Jonesville is a part of them and they don't even know about it.
As for my family, we are telling our Jonesville story at every opportunity. I share the story when I speak of being crowned as the first African-American homecoming queen at Western Kentucky University, right here on this campus, on the land of my ancestors. I share the history by creating a mural that depicts a visual story of Jonesville, which is located in the WKU Kentucky Museum. My sister shared the story while serving as the first director of the Minority Student Services at WKU. And now my son teaches at Jonesville Academy for Young Men that meets on the Western's campus. We are dedicated to honoring our Jonesville ancestors for the sacrifice that has benefited so many others. This is a story worth being told.
I became interested in the Jonesville community, submitting articles to our newspaper as a high school columnist. My mom, too, became a critical journalist in her spare time, often writing about Jonesville and other communities that faced its same fateful end. She'd return to earn her master's degree, be inducted into the Teacher Hall of Fame, house of the university, and ultimately receive her honorary doctorate here. Each time she felt like she was returning to her literal home where her story began, but was ultimately disrupted, and she was returning home. To me, the name Jonesville reflects the roots that define who I am as a person, even though I never had the opportunity to set foot in the community. The spirit of Jonesville lives on through the stories we continue to uncover and tell for present and future generations.
Yeah. So when I hear Jonesville, I hear a sense of pride, a sense of ownership, a sense of identity.
It represented love and unity to me. That's what comes to my mind first: love and unity in a community, and that becomes ingrained in your spirit.
A very peaceful place, happy place. The people that lived there were happy.
Home. That's home. That's my first thing. Peaceful, happy, safe, loving, comfortable, home. That's all I think about. And sweet. It was a very sweet place to be.
When sunflowers fall. When sunflowers fall, heavy storm clouds crowd. Loud winds race through sheets hanging out to dry. When sunflowers fall, husbands, fathers, businessmen, pastors, stone masons, men pinstriped suits, cufflinks unlinked. When sunflowers fall, wives, mothers, businesswomen, piano players, seamstresses, songstresses, women, shawls, blouses, white gloves, red shoes worn. When sunflowers fall, heavy shoulders embrace, carrying suitcases. Depart home, depart home's own department. Grocery stores, restaurants, businesses, churches they own. In trails of tears, torn tales born. When sunflowers fall. When sunflowers fall, girls, white dresses, double dutching, red shoes worn, girls and boys' fingers pointing the way, pointing the reason. When sunflowers fall, red shoes, clicking heel, still cannot go home to their hill. When sunflowers fall, sunflowers tower, crowd and race through homes. When sunflowers fall, sunflowers flood streets. Sunflowers saturate airs, saturate the sheaves. When sunflowers fall.